together with Rachel Halpern. As I said, I'm Jeroen Bernstein, co-chair of NF Switzerland, together with Rachel Halpern. This event was organized together with NIF Germany and NIF Austria. I want to thank Daniel Sokatch, the CEO of New Israel Fund and author of Can We Talk About Israel, a guide for the curious, confused, and conflicted, for participating, and Hanno Loewy for moderating this discussion. Hanno Loewy was born in 1961 in Frankfurt am Main, scholar of literature and film, exhibition organizer and publicist. He founded and he was the founding director of the Fritz Bauer Institute in Frankfurt am Main. Since 2004, director of the Jewish Museum Hohenems in Austria, and from 2011 to 17, president of the Association of European Jewish Museums. Publications and exhibitions on Jewish and present history, film theory, film history and photography, as well as on history and reception of the Holocaust. Most recently, his book all about Tel Aviv-Jaffa, The Invention of a City, co-edited with Hannes Sulzenbacher. Before we begin, a quick remark of housekeeping of this Zoom today. You can use the chat function to post short questions or remarks, but we cannot promise to integrate all of them in the discussion today. So welcome, Hanno and Daniel, and take it away.
Thank you so much for inviting us to this Zoom talk. And even if it's nicer to be together in a real space, we all know that these Zoom formats also have one wonderful aspect, and that is bringing together people over a great distance to talk with each other. And we already enjoyed that very often with very diverse audiences, where we had people from Jerusalem, Ramallah, New York, London, or wherever in a virtual room, which is also something that we learned to enjoy during the last 2 years. Still, I would love to start with a few remarks to introduce Daniel to you, whom you probably most of you know. I mean, he is the chief executive officer, how things are called in the US very often, and in modern business as well all over the world today, of the New Israel Fund, which is, as you know, a very remarkable institution that is trying to support all kinds of civil engagement in Israel and around Israel, focusing on human rights and equality and civil engagement. He is writing regularly for papers like the Washington Post or the New York Times. He, which is already one of these humorous details that we will maybe come discussing your book a little, for several times. I think it's written 4 times for the Forward 50, the most influential, thought-provoking Jewish Americans. Taking your book into my hand, and it's something really to read, a good read for everybody, shows that you're not only with big earnest go into the history of this conflict, but also with quite a sense of humor. And you also were supported in this enterprise, particularly in the humorous part of this enterprise, by Christopher Noxon, who illustrated the book with a lot of sketches and scenes that highlight certain aspects of the book. My first question to start our discussion is, I mean, in a situation with heated debates about Israel that become more toxic every day, just tomorrow, I think Jewish students, but particularly non-Jewish anti-Semitism activists are going to protest in front of the office of Amnesty International Berlin, and asking or threatening them by boycott if they don't boycott their major institution, their umbrella organization, because just a recent report, or just an upcoming report of Amnesty UK is taking a pretty harsh stand on Israeli politics in the West Bank. But now we will have protesters in front of a Human Rights Watch organization in Berlin tomorrow. So there's a very heated atmosphere. And why did you choose to write your book in such a light, personal, and humorous tone?
Thank you, Hanno. It's a good way to start our conversation. First, let me again say, when we were all coming on the screen a moment ago, I had the chance to say hello to some of you. It's Hanno really summed it up. It's wonderful. It is the silver lining of this awful time that we are in the world, that we get to be together on Zoom in a way that we didn't used to be. And so it's wonderful to see so many of you. And I have to just acknowledge my embarrassment at I'm in this job for 13 years. My Hebrew's pretty good, and so I can do everything I need to do with my Israeli team and with Israeli audiences, but I don't have German. So I just want to acknowledge how embarrassing it is that there are 40 of you and one of me, and we're doing this in English just because of my American inability to speak the common language that the rest of you have. So just duly noted. I'm ashamed of myself. Now we'll move on. Look, the reason I chose to write, I get a lot of times when I have these conversations, I'm asked first off, why did you choose to write the book at this time? And that's why I appreciate, Hanno, the twist that you put on the question, which is why. Okay, it will be better than German, Jacques, but it will still not be very good. Jacques suggests I speak in French. Je parle français un petit peu, but not good enough. So,
well, great. I didn't know that.
But so invite me to Geneva and you'll find out. So,
okay.
So the answer
Don't say it twice.
The answer to the question of why write the book now and why write the book in this particular style is a similar one, I suppose. The reason I wrote the book in this way is because in my 13 years at New Israel Fund, and really for decades before that, as someone who's deeply immersed in these issues and committed to the conversation, the discourse about Israel, in Israel, between diasporic Jewish communities and Israel, between Israel and the world, it has been apparent to me, as I'm sure it has been to all of you, that there has been a significant change in the tone and tenor of the discourse and the debate. It has become a virulent, a vituperative, an emotional, difficult, awful conversation for many people. And this is particularly the case I see in the US and in the UK and Australia, our English-speaking areas. I would not be surprised if you all find the same. But the tenor and level of the discourse has declined to a point where many, many people want nothing to do with the conversation at all. I'm talking not only about Jews, but also about non-Jews, people who are, as I write in the subtitle, curious, confused, conflicted. I would add to that compassionate, caring, but they feel that they can't even approach the issue of Israel for fear of the emotional landmines and challenges of doing so. And so as I thought about this project and felt that, when I was a young man, when I was a young person, there were books that really helped me figure this issue out and that gave me the tools to navigate it and understand it. Books like Amos Oz, the late great Israeli author who wrote In the Land of Israel. That was the English title. David Grossman, who wrote The Yellow Wind. Again, I apologize for not knowing the titles in German. And Sleeping on a Wire, and the American journalist Thomas Friedman, who wrote a book called From Beirut to Jerusalem. These were sort of even-handed, wise books that gave me, as a young person, the tools I needed to sort of really figure this out. And I felt that that was missing in today's, on the bookshelves today. And I also felt that the discourse had changed from the 80s when I was reading those books. And now, decades later, as I just said, it was a totally different conversation, and frankly, a pretty awful one. And so I felt I had two challenges. On the one hand, there were many books there are many books about Israel, obviously. And many of them fall into two categories. The first, neither of which I wanted to write. The first category I would call advocacy books, right? These are books that are really meant to engender sympathy or support for one of the sides to the conflict, right? Sometimes they are relatively moderate, sometimes they are political screeds or polemics, but they are not attempting to hold both stories of both peoples with compassion and concern. They don't recognize the legitimacy of both Israeli and Palestinian, Jewish and Arab connections to the land, their legitimate claims to the land. They don't acknowledge the two traumas that our two peoples have had and the histories that we've had. And I wasn't interested in those books. Look, I'm a liberal American Jew, a progressive Zionist, deeply connected to Israel and the Israeli narrative, but I also hold both of those stories in my hands, as I said, with compassion, and I try to understand both. The second category of book that I didn't want to write was a much better one from my perspective, and these are books by experts for experts, by scholars for scholars. Now, these are essential for people trying to go deep into the subject, but they are not particularly accessible to the general reader, or the person who really wants to understand, A, what happened, and B, why is this making so many people so crazy, right? This issue of Israel. And so the result of all of this was my decision to approach the book in the way, Hanno, that you, I think, very accurately described it. I wanted it to be even-handed and compassionate, and I wanted it to be accessible. So in order to do that, I felt I had to try and capture. Many of you on this call are old friends of mine, and so I think I try when I communicate for New Israel Fund I do it in a way that tries to engage the listener, that is not so academic or technical that it's not easy to understand. And I also don't want to fall into the trap of easy answers and populism. So I wanted to translate that style into the written page. And Hanno, it's interesting because it turns out writing a book like this is very different than writing an opinion piece for the New York Times or for the Washington Post or for Haaretz, right, which I do all the time. Here I had to try to, ironically, capture what I really sound like when I talk, as opposed to what I write for a newspaper, which is kind of a version of what I sound like. And so I felt that the humor and the tone were very important to allow people to engage with the material. My wife, who is a real author, who Pierre, hello Pierre, has met, she said, you ought to talk to our friend Christopher, who is a very talented illustrator, because you need maps and graphs, but he could make them in a subtle way warm and approachable. And I kind of raised my eyebrow at this, but she's much smarter and more creative than I am. So I gave it a shot. And of course, what Christopher produced were not just maps and graphs, but also those sketches. And they really did create an accessibility. And I remember at Bloomsbury, at the publishing house, when I sent the illustrations in, they all loved them, right? They said, this is just the thing to make the book that much more accessible. So that's why, as we say in Hebrew, davka, because of the seriousness and the gravity of the debate, because of the controversy, because the average reader, certainly in the English-speaking world, and I'll guess elsewhere, who is interested and concerned about this issue, maybe even knows a thing or two, does not understand why people are protesting outside of Amnesty International, an organization that won the Nobel Peace Prize in living memory. And so because of the level of complexity and the problematic discourse. I wanted to write something that people could actually read and digest in a way that actually encouraged them to finish the book, as opposed to throw it across the room.
Let me try an argument, or let me try an idea about it. I mean, in a way, the book comes along like an antidote of a certain kind of not partisan view, a very rich of perspective view, as you honestly describe it, because you write that book as a liberal Jew, very much engaged with and for Israel, but you still write it in a very much non-partisan way, which in the German or even Austrian and not that much Switzerland, the Swiss discussion is still more relaxed than we have it in Germany or in Austria today. In Germany, this kind of non-partisan view would already cause a scandal. And the interesting thing is that you write the book in a very heated debate that you have in the US or in the UK, but you write the book from the perspective of an American who's part of a society in which a large number of Jews are living and entertaining the fun of a real Jewish variety and discourse. The interesting thing is that in Germany, to quote the other extreme, you have a discussion with very rare Jewish participants. I mean, there's a small number of people, and you have a large number of people who are pretending to take care of Jews or of Israel. And they do it today with a kind of fanaticism that is getting more and more irritating every day. And still, you have that kind of growing fanaticism also in the debates inside of the Jewish communities. And the idea that comes to my mind, particularly when I was reading your book, is that there's a kind of panic in the air, and that the panic has a reason. And the reason is that for many, many years, the two-state solution was a kind of idea you could recite to, even if you say not today. But it was a kind of a promise. It was something to say, okay, how hard things are today, how difficult it is, how violent the opposition. There is a solution, and it will come at some day. We will split the territory. One is on the one side and the others are on the other side. And today, I mean, more and more people realize that this might not be a real option anymore, but a kind of smokescreen behind you don't really react to the reality of today. And the interesting thing is that both the New Israel Fund and even more your book is simply putting aside this discussion of one state, two state, three states, four states, cantons, or binational, trinational, whatever. You just talk about Israel and the need to establish civil rights for everybody, political rights for everybody, equality, and postpone the bigger issues to some other day, but work on the reality of today. And that's how I understood the end of the book. That really comes to the personal perspective of three different people living in the country and their everyday needs. And I also read your book as a kind of plaidoyer for letting these big issues aside for a moment and just work on the reality of the life of people in Israel and in the territories.
Well, so interestingly, I would you said, the issue of one state, two state, what I like to say in America is red state, blue state, right? That you feel that the NIF and even more so the book pushes that aside. I think you're correct to a point, but then I think the book deals with it more than the New Israel Fund in some respects. In the book, I do, you know, and what I try, it is true that I don't provide a prescription at the end of the book for what should happen. And one of my 3 favorite pieces of criticism of the book, in an otherwise very favorable review in the Sunday New York Times Book Review, and I have to I'm trying to impress upon you all what that means for my 80-year-old Jewish mother, that her son's book was reviewed in the New York Times Sunday Book Review. If I won the Nobel Prize for Physics, a subject about which I know nothing, it would not be as impressive to her as the book review. But in this otherwise positive book review, the reviewer concludes by saying, but in the end, Sokatch doesn't offer a solution, rather just hope. And I sort of felt, well, guilty as charged, right? If people read the book expecting my book to have the solution to a problem that has proved insoluble for the last 100 years, unfortunately, they'll be disappointed, I suppose. And I don't apologize for finding hope in these people, these activists, of whom those of us at NIF we know thousands and thousands of them. Having said that, I do make it clear in the book that when it comes to the resolution of the conflict and the two-state solution, the problem is not a lack of political creativity, right? I write in the book. We know from everywhere, up to the Clinton parameters and the negotiations at Tage, which ended, which were the last official delegations that met in 2000 of that round of the peace process, all the way up to a few years later when Olmert comes to power. We know what the basic contours of a two-state solution are going to look like. The issue of Jerusalem remains unresolved, and a few other issues, but for the most part, we kind of know what the basic outline would look like. And at times, each of the players has signaled, yes, I am interested in that. The problem is they have not, at the one time when Abbas and Olmert both sort of signaled that they were interested, George Bush was the president, and he had other ideas about the Middle East. He was too busy breaking the world order in the Middle East at that moment. But, other times you've had an Israeli prime minister and an American president, but you haven't had the PA leader who was ready to close the deal. And now for the last 12 or 13 years, we've had 2 successive Israeli prime ministers who have said quite clearly, no two-state solution on my watch. So despite that being the official position of the Israeli government, right? They have said no. So you're not wrong, of course, in suggesting that it feels to many of us that the two-state solution is further away and maybe even beyond the realm of possibility, and that may be. But I felt that my job as an author was to point out several things. One, that the reason there isn't a two-state solution now is not because of some sort of magical intervention, that somehow kept it from happening. It's because there have been those dedicated to murdering their way out of it, whether you are Yigal Amir, who murdered a prime minister, or the Hamas terrorists who blew up buses. And then in the last decades, there's been no desire, no political will for that. So I think that, I state that, and of course it becomes harder and harder as Israel builds more and more settlements, as hearts are hardened, as Palestinians lose any kind of horizon for hope, as a new American administration shows no indication of involving itself. And I'll point out, it's the 3rd, maybe the 4th American administration in a row that has signaled something very clearly to the Israelis and the Palestinians for very different reasons. George Bush, because he wanted to, do what he did in Iraq. Then Barack Obama, who specifically said, we are going to pivot away from the Middle East to Asia, to East Asia. And then Donald Trump, who was America first. And then Joe Biden, who pulled troops out of Afghanistan. My friends, the United States, as I think you all know, is diminishing in many respects and is pulling out of its role. We've seen now 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans for 4 different reasons who have contracted the American presence in the Middle East. So all of this does make the two-state solution far less likely. As I point out in the book, there aren't a lot of other more possible solutions that seem to be on the horizon, although there are some that you mentioned. But then finally, what I think that I do pretty clearly in the book is say, if the two-state solution is not going to happen because there isn't the political will to achieve it, then you have to contend with either the further degradation of the situation so that it looks more and more like the Balkans or Beirut, because of course, the status quo is not really a status quo, because things get worse and worse. But at the end of the day, what will likely happen more and more is what happened in my conversation with Mr. Tamimi, the Palestinian activist who I write about at the end of the settlement chapter, who, when I saw him the last time I was in Israel before COVID, I sat with him at his house in his village, which straddles Area B and Area C. And he told me, this longtime activist, pro two-state solution, nonviolent resistance guy, he said, I know his nephew had just been shot in the face with a rubber bullet, and his daughter had been captured on camera slapping an Israeli soldier during this incident, and then had spent months and months in jail. And Tamimi said, I don't believe in the two-state solution anymore. And I said, well, what do you believe in? And I said, what do you want if not two states? He said, well, I don't believe in it because the Israelis will never agree to it. They don't want it, and so we won't have it. And I said, well, what do you want then? And he said, well, I want to take my children to the beach. It's 40 kilometers from here. They've never seen the sea, and I want the vote. And that, for me, my job is in sharing that with my readers. I don't think NIF's position or my book's position is to lay out a blueprint for how the conflict should be resolved. There are those books, but for me, it's to present where we are.
Yeah, I mean, doing that, I mean, you trigger one question, and that is, anyhow, if it's one state, two state, whatever, it will all end with the same question, and that is, will the state or the states that will occupy the territory of Israel and Palestine in, I don't know, 50, hundreds or whatever years, will grant equality to all its citizens. So even if you talk about two states, you talk about one-state solutions.
Yeah.
And the activities of New Israel Fund are following that goal. And the way you focus the questions in the book is also leading to the question that whatever you divide that territory into, cantons, states, whatever, federal, country, states, there have been a sense of equality on both sides, however. And that leads to one question that is raised here already in the chat, and that is the hot potato that you also touch in your book, which is a hot potato in the US for quite a while, and in the US and even and also in England. It's a movement that indeed engages quite a lot of people, while in Germany it's more a kind of a phantasma that is used in politics, the BDS movement. Mm-hmm. I have two questions here in the chat, and that is, I have to focus it a bit because it's long questions. But,
and I apologize, I can never read the chats when I do these talks. It's too hard for me to.
Pardon?
I'm apologizing in advance for not reading the chats.
I have to, and I help you.
Of course.
So there's one question about the BDS and the donors of New Israel Fund. So if a clear stand to the subject of BDS might not endanger the donor base of New Israel Fund, which is a question coming from Felix, and it's also supported by Mark Baer. Hello, Mark. And to summarize a bit, it's be careful with understanding BDS. The question that I would raise is, can you avoid understanding BDS Because if you don't understand BDS, you fall into a line of demonizing it, which is very close to delegitimizing every Palestinian stand in the conflict, which I think is the main political target in all the talk about BDS that is so prominent today, because it simply says because BDS is anti-Semitic, the Palestinians are anti-Semitic, and because they are anti-Semitic, they have no legitimacy in asking for anything. I mean, that is, for me, the very brief summary of the kind of debate you have in the mainstream and in the anti-BDS boycott movement that is actually much stronger than the BDS movement itself. On the other hand, you have these very crude sympathies for BDS in the left camp that is also making me unpleasant, because it introduces a kind of boycott ethos that is only working in the field where we are in the field of culture, academics, discourse. The only field in which BDS has some impact is making it more difficult to talk with Palestinians and to talk with Israeli dissidents. So it has a very paradoxic impact, the BDS movement, which is far from being anti-Semitic. It's simply destroying communication with those you can communicate with. So we have a problem on both sides. But this whole fanatism around the BDS issue is something you can hardly avoid at the moment. I mean, every day there is a campaign in the German press against the Documenta and against Amnesty and against certain artists and against Jewish peace camps and whatever. You have it every day, and simply don't saying anything about it, I'm not sure if it's an option.
Well, Hanno, as for that sort of larger second point, clearly I excuse me, I agree with you, which is why I wrote about it. And if you read the chapter on BDS, which I call What We Talk About When We Talk About BDS, because I'm paying homage to a short story that I loved that I read years ago, which is called What We Talk About When We Talk About Love. But the reason I used that title was because we're often not talking about the same thing at all when we have this conversation over BDS. And I feel, as I think you do, that it does none of us any good to ignore it, to pretend that we don't see it, to not even talk about it. And so my intent in writing that chapter was to, as we say, unpack it, really see what it is we're talking about, identify what is the BDS movement, right? And what is it not? What is it demanding? What are the reasons that some people who are sympathetic with a nonviolent movement that seems to be acting for Palestinian rights, why do some of us feel nervous about the intention, which may seem to be to see the end of Israel as it's currently construed as a Jewish democratic state and something in its place? Why one can say, I'm not in favor of that tactic, that set of tactics, because I don't think they're the right set of tools at this moment to help to make Israel change, or because I worry about the intent of the BDS movement, while saying I also object to its criminalization or demonization. So, and at the same time, you have the complexity of a very intentional conflation on the part of the Israeli government and many of its supporters out there who put into the same category, sort of dishonestly, I would argue, those calling for boycott, divestment, and sanction against Israel, and those calling for boycotts against the settlements. And lest you think that I'm just making this up, in 2011, Israel passed a law, Chok HaCherem, the boycott law. And the boycott law made it a civil offense. At first, it was to be a crime, but they turned it into a civil offense for any Israeli to call for or publicly support a call for boycott, divestment of sanctions against Israel or any territories under Israel's control. And that means the settlements, right? And they did this not in response to the BDS movement, which is an actual organizational movement started by a man called Omar Barghouti, who is now in Seattle, Washington, a Palestinian Israeli, calling for Israel to be treated like apartheid-era South Africa. And as you said, Hanno, a complete severing of economic, tourist, academic, cultural, military, intelligence ties with Israel. And by the way, like the idea that there would be sanctions and divestment from Israel is not a particularly serious one. The boycotts of Israel are what has manifested itself in the BDS movement. But it was not in response to that Israel passed the anti-boycott law. Rather, Israel passed the anti-boycott law in response to a public call by dozens of very prominent Israeli performers, dancers, actors, musicians, who the year before the law was passed, took out full-page ads in the Hebrew press in which they said, we, the undersigned, as Zionists and patriotic Israelis, refuse to play at the state-built theater, the Theatron, in Ariel, one of the larger settlements in the northern West Bank, in Samaria, Shomron. And they said, we call upon other Israeli artists of conscience to join us because we believe the settlement enterprise is killing Israeli democracy and thus is an existential threat to the existence of Israel as a democracy that is the nation state of the Jewish people. And it was in response to that the Israeli government passed the boycott law, which later was manifest in an amendment to the entry law. So now, technically, if you call for boycotts of Israel or divestments or sanctions against Israel, or the settlements, you will be denied entry into Israel, although they haven't technically applied that very often. Although they did to 2 U.S. congresswomen, which is we won't get into that unless people want to, but this was something that even Netanyahu didn't want to do until Donald Trump told him to do it, and he did it. But so all of this is to say, the debate, the discourse over BDS is hysterical often, and doesn't really focus on what's actually happening. And my intention in writing the chapter was to lay out all of these pieces, to say you can be skeptical of and not even support BDS because you think it's the wrong set of tools, or you think it's you don't agree with the intention, or you're not sure of the intention of the movement, while still opposing its criminalization or the accusation that it's anti-Semitism. The chapter is meant to say, as you sort of did, Hanno, Palestinians have been told by all of us, by the world, violence is not an acceptable way of pursuing your grievances, which I think we all agree with. But Israel's also told the Palestinians, as have Israel supporters, you also can't go to the International Criminal Court, right? That is unacceptable. We've also told the Palestinians you can't go to the UN Security Council. That is unacceptable. We've told the Palestinians, Israelis have said to the Palestinians, you can't have mass protests. We will shut them down. We just saw it at Sheikh Jarrah. So, Palestinians who say, okay, so we'll do this instead, are told, no, you're being anti-Semitic. So the chapter is meant to lay out and explore and explain all of these different facets to the debate. Now, very quickly to address the first point, and perhaps this is what was being addressed in the chat, and if I didn't get it right, please feel free to ask again. I want to be very clear. Nothing I wrote in the book was written without, none of the areas of controversy were written without close consultation with NIF leadership. Now, ultimately, there were no areas, and I was fairly certain this would be the case, where I would never write something in a book that was contrary to NIF's policy. That's too damaging, too dangerous, too confusing. And also, it happens not to be the case. I don't necessarily agree with every NIF grant that we've ever made or love every one of our organizations equally, but there's no NIF position that is not also a position that I personally hold and would feel comfortable writing about. So NIF's position on BDS is NIF as an organization does not support the BDS movement, but we also object to its criminalization. We do not believe that it is de facto anti-Semitic, and we refuse to fall in line with Israel's intentional conflation of boycotting Israel and boycotting the settlements. And so, while I agree, it's very important to be careful in this debate at all for all kinds of reasons. Nothing I wrote about this issue in BDS is contrary to the official NIF set of positions, which are, of course, more complex and nuanced than most positions about BDS, because that's who we are. We're a group of people who understand that we are often operating in the grays. The one other thing I want to say, which is probably muvan me'elav, as we say in Hebrew, and totally apparent to everybody, and I recognize it. This conversation with this particular trifecta of NIF communities in these three countries is totally unique in the NIF world, right? Because for reasons that don't bear repeating, right? Because but just to say, it is much, I recognize that as difficult as the debate is in the United States and in Israel, I don't know if you saw the Haaretz article a couple of days ago, an argument among demographers about the actual size of the American Jewish community. Is it 6 million? Is it 9.5 million? It depends on how you count. But it's one of obviously the two great world Jewish communities, and Israel is the other. And there is, at least in the United States, it's a terrible, challenging conversation. But we have millions of American Jews who sort of don't toe the line on everything that the local Jewish community or Israel's foreign ministry says. So I understand that it is much easier and safer to have this conversation and to write and talk about these things where I am than where you are, especially those of you who are in Austria and Germany, and especially those of you who are in Germany, with its obviously unique history and completely different perspective on these things. So I don't know what to draw from that except to say, I would, if I were a German liberal Jew, I would have written a very different book, I'm sure.
I have an interesting quote for you. And the question that I pose to myself very often is, would we obey to the words of Volker Beck, who is the German official in charge to combat anti-Semitism? I mean, that's his title. And in, I don't know which conversation, he made an interesting sentence, and that was, these leftist Jews should pay more, they should be more sensitive with the German problem with the past. It's very close to the very nice proverb, I think, coined by an Israeli psychotherapist once, that the Germans would never forgive Auschwitz, never forgive the Jews Auschwitz.
Yeah.
But we're pretty close to that kind of politics today, becoming official politics. We should not discuss our problems because the Germans have their problems with the past. And I'm not exactly sure if it's a good strategy to go into. Oh, sorry. Jörn Böhme is helpful, and he helped me. It's not Volker Beck, sure. It's Felix Klein, who is the German representative to combat anti-Semitism. It's not Volker Beck. Volker Beck is even a bit more radical, if it's possible. Thank you, Jörn, for this correction. No, I was talking about Felix Klein. But this is the kind of discourse we indeed have in Germany. Yeah. And we partly have in Austria. And we, I guess, also have a bit of in Switzerland, but I wouldn't say that much. But I think, I'm not sure where it would lead to simply say that we have to follow German rules of silencing Jewish voices. I think this is a very dangerous trap.
Yeah, I mean,
open.
There's an irony to it, of course, which is apparent to all of us. And while I'm loath ever to weigh into any examination of psychological, deep-seated motives when it comes to this issue, when I talk to anyone from NIF Switzerland, because for those of you in Germany and Austria, you may not know this, 100% of the NIF Swiss community are psychiatrists and psychologists. So I'm not only not in my area of expertise, I exaggerate only a little bit. I'm not only not in my area of expertise, I am right in the midst of my dear friend's area of expertise. So I would never deign to opine about this, except to say, wherever we are, and I understand how radically different the experience is for Jews in Germany and Austria, Hanno, what you said at the end of your comment rings true with me, which is it raises my eyebrow to think that now German Jews need to be wary of the problems that German non-Jews have with the fact that the Holocaust happened and was perpetrated by Germans, right? I mean, that Germany will never forgive the Jews Auschwitz. It sums it all up. And again, I say that from the relative security of San Francisco, you know, and frankly, and Tel Aviv, and it's not the same thing. And I hear that. And you know, certainly in the context of where I operate, you know, the question of dirty laundry, right? You know, look, you get NIF traditionally gets several different types of opposition, you know, and in a way that's the trickiest one. The easiest one are for those of you who are longtime NIFers, you know, that's the hard right wing Interzu, you know, you guys are responsible for all of Israel's problems. Your grantees are anti-Israel terrorists. You're anti-Semitic. You're self-hating. That's the easiest one because it's nonsensical. That's what neo-authoritarians do everywhere, right? Whether they're the Donald Trump folks here or the ultra Bibi folks there. That's easy to dismiss. You know, another critique is, well, you get some things right, but you get so many other things wrong, and it discredits what you do. That's usually pretty easy to deal with as well. The hardest one to respond to, the most painful one, is I know that what you and your organization say and do is correct and right, but please don't say and do those things because it's dirty laundry. Now, where I live, it's dirty laundry because it makes Israel look bad. And where some of you live, it's dirty laundry that makes you as a community feel insecure. So I acknowledge that those are real differences. And yet, maybe I'm too much of a Californian, but I believe in the disinfectant quality of sunlight. And that when we're honest about things, you know, there's a new book out by a guy called Eliezer Tauber, who is a Bar Ilan University historian, who has written a book called something like The Massacre That Never Was, in which, contrary to history and scholarship, he argues that Dir Yassin, right, the incident of the massacre by Irgun and Sterngang, mostly Sterngang militants in the pre-state era, the massacre of between 100 and 200 Palestinian civilians in a village which is on a hill, which is now part of Jerusalem. There's a mental hospital, a psychiatric hospital. Look, it always comes back when we're talking to the Swiss. A psychiatric hospital stands at that site now. And Tauber says, no, it was not a massacre. It's all made up. Now, this is, of course, not nonsensical. And there's a debate going on right now about this. I mean, this in the face of Benny Morris and a whole generation of Israeli historians who've shown and recounted what's happened there. But you know, once again, the best argument that people have for supporting Tauber's ridiculous claim is not that he's right, but that, you know, it's bad for the Jews if people know that these kinds of things happen 75, 80 years ago. And I don't buy it. And certainly in the milieu in which I work here in the States and in Israel, that is not a good rationale not to have tough conversations about what's really going on. But I understand it feels very different from where many of you sit.
I mean, it's a very painful but real conflation.
Yeah.
That if you walk through the history exhibition of Yad Vashem, which takes you through the darkest chapter, and it's staged that way, and in the end you step on the balcony, which is pretty triumphant because it's big, it's wide.
Yerushalayim.
You step into the light and you see Yerushalayim. But if you look a little to the right, the next hill you stare on is the hill you were talking about. It's Dir Yassin. And you see the water tower. You don't really see the few remnants of the village that are now part of this mental hospital where they try to cure the Jerusalem syndrome. But I mean, it's so close.
Yeah.
And I know people were fired from the staff of Yad Vashem because they dared to tell people. I mean, people who were guides at Yad Vashem were simply fired when they dare to tell people what they were looking at. And I think this is not working forever.
Look, I remember.
I have a question. I have two questions. Yeah,
please. I was just going to say that I remember this moment, which was revelatory for me. Revelatory. Rabin had been assassinated about 2 months after I moved from Israel back home. I'd lived there for a couple of years, and several months later, 6 months later, I was in law school, and his memoirs were re-released right after his death. The publisher released his memoirs, but now, after his death and 45 or 50 years having had passed, the military censor who had redacted much of the original memoir, right? The appendix included censored material, right, that had not been allowed in the first issuing of the memoirs, even though this guy served on two occasions as the Prime Minister of Israel, right? But now, after his death and almost half a century later, we could finally see what the military censor cut out of Rabin's official memoir. and the revelatory part was reading in the appendix about Rabin's recounting his meeting with Yigal Alon, right, another great Israeli who in those days was a Haganah and later early IDF officer. The two of them went to see Ben Gurion, and they asked him, what do we do about the town of Lida, which, of course, as you all know, is Lod, where the airport is, and which was a city of tens of thousands of Arabs, or about 10,000 Arabs, next to Ramleh, another town still there, with about 10,000 Arab residents. And they said, what do we do about these two big towns, which are between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, right near Latrun, right on the road going up to Jerusalem? And Ben Gurion gestured with his hand, get them out. And they understood what he meant. And Rabin writes, it was a terrible, terrible thing. Psychologically, it was terribly damaging for us to go door to door with our guns and say, you have a half an hour to get out or we'll shoot you. But they left, and we marched them to the border, then the border with Jordan. We forced them over the border. The residents of Ramla, he writes, did not need us to do that when they saw what we did to Lod. And he essentially said, it haunts us to this day, but this is what we had to do. And I read that, and I thought, there's so much energy spent in whitewashing the events surrounding Israel's birth. I was raised to if someone had told me that story, I would have said that's anti-Semitic. How could you say that? But here it was, Yitzhak Rabin, one of the greatest heroes of Israeli history, recounting what happened. And I remember thinking at that moment, it's got to be okay to talk about these things. I mean, as an American, right, as someone who lives on a stolen continent, right, it doesn't undermine the legitimacy of the United States of America or Canada or Australia that we uprooted, displaced, and practiced something akin to genocide on native populations. It's a terrible, bloody chapter in history that the countries have to come to terms with and move on. And I think that has to be true for Israel too. But of course, we're talking about a time frame that is very different, and it's much more recent, and the Holocaust. Right. So it always sort of, I know it's naive sounding for me to say it, but I'm always struck by this crazy effort on the part of some of Israel and some of its defenders to whitewash a history that Rabin was perfectly comfortable in sharing with the world, because he knew Israel was not going to be toppled if the truth about its complicated and messy origins was revealed.
I have the privilege to read through the chat while
during my long answer.
I just want to not uphold that there is a bit of a discussion around that is interesting, because it really is about a bit of an NIF politics, and there is a kind of resolution in it which I want to share because I love it, how it's worded. Jacques put into the chat, maybe one could say that BDS is an answer we don't share to a problem we clearly recognize. this answer we don't share isn't anti-Semitic in itself. And Mark Bear is answering, thanks, Jack. Perfect. So
well, Jacques' articulation is a more eloquent version of what the NIF policy on BDS is. It's exactly that. Not surprisingly, since he is an NIF leader.
I just love to read that, and it's good to see that there's the possibility for a simply rational discussion about the subject. I also want to
among us there is among those of us on this call in the NIF community there is. I'm not so sure how far beyond that, but yes, you're right.
Yeah, there was a question by Jörn Böhme and another one by Amir Teilhaber that I just want to share with you. And because we are already coming to the closure somehow, I think at 15 past 9 at least, I was told that our Zoom talk should come to a closure. Jörn Böhme asks, how does your notion that the nation-state law threatens to upend the decades-long, carefully calibrated balance between the Jewish and the democratic aspects of Israel's identity go together with your statement concerning the status of Palestinian citizens of Israel, but while they are officially equal in many ways, they are not?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and I will say that for the second time in all of the book talks that I've done, and I've done dozens and dozens of them since the book was released in October, that's the second time someone has made a comment that made me think, for the paperback, I need to actually make something clearer, because you're absolutely right. Because I cannot write that they are equal on paper, because the nation state law proves otherwise. And all I can say is thank you for that comment, because I am going to amend that in the paperback edition, which comes out in the fall of this year. They were equal on paper, and in many respects still are, but not anymore because of the impact of the nation state law, which, less worrying is its, although awful, is its denigration of the official status of the Arabic language. But of course, the real point here, as the questioner I think is implying, is that a nation state law that says that only the Jews have the right to self-determination and to decide essentially the future of the state of Israel, it does make them manifestly less than equal on paper as well as in reality. So I thank the questioner for that question, because you've just added the second change to the book when it goes to paperback. And I'm jotting it down.
Here's the other question by Amir Teilhaber, who is looking forward to reading the book, but he is maneuvering between your self-description as a Zionist and his observation that he got from a recent talk at NIF, that the youth on the hilltops in the settlements are convinced that they are representing the new Zionism. And his question is, in front of the background that more and more Zionism is, by parts of the political camps, considered as an equivalent to settler colonialism, how you would deal with this development, and if you think that, or if everybody thinks that it's necessary to struggle more over what Zionism in fact is, or if Zionism is no longer that central to the cause, even as we continue to care deeply about Israel. So
yeah,
does it still make sense to combat about the meaning of Zionism, or to put his words a little more frank, should we admit that Zionism is not longer a central?
Well, yeah, I mean, and Amir, thank you for that question. I think, if you do read the book, excuse me, you'll see that I sort of try to break down this discourse over Zionism, much as I did the BDS discourse. And so what I say is, I'm often asked, are you a Zionist? And it's become a litmus test. First, it was a litmus test by the center and the right in Israel. Always when I'm interviewed in the Israeli press, do you identify as a Zionist? Is NIF a Zionist organization? And there, my answer, which is kind of what prompted the description I made earlier, is if by being a Zionist you mean I embrace the tenets of, in particular, the 13th and 14th paragraph of Israel's founding proclamation of independence, then the answer is yes, that I support the notion of Israel as it never says democratic, incidentally, in the Proclamation of Independence, interestingly, as many of you probably know, but I support the notion of an Israel that is a place of refuge and a homeland, a place, in the words of the document, for the ingathering of the exiles, and at the same time, as the 14th paragraph states clearly, a place that offers complete equality for all citizens, regardless of race, religion, ethnicity, and I think this is pretty impressive, sex, gender. Oftentimes people don't believe it. They think I'm exaggerating, but if you go look, it says sex in English. And for me, that's the vision of Israel that I support. If someone considers that Zionist, then that's what I am. I had no problem sort of saying that's what I am. But that's the short answer, because people use it as a litmus test, right? And now they use it as a litmus test increasingly on the social and racial justice left in America. But the chapter on Zionism, or the section on Zionism, could have been titled what we talk about when we talk about Zionism, just like the BDS chapter, because we're having different conversations, of course. And Zionism, the argument and the discourse over the term Zionism is no longer about what the word Zionism actually means. And so I write in the book that it always strikes me as a kind of silly and antique, archaic term, and the conversation about it is akin to someone asking me, Daniel, are you pro-Confederacy or pro-Northern Union about the Civil War, right, which happened in America 170 some odd years ago? So I think that, obviously, as many of us know, right, like Zionism was the idea and the movement that identified the need for Jewish self-determination in a state, and the state would be in what we now call Israel, right? We all know that earlier in Switzerland, in Basel, Pierre's taken me to see it. There were arguments about where it should be, but that's really what Zionism means. But of course, now it means something different. And to my mind, it's a bit of an anachronism, right? That is a term from the past that still lives on in the present, but with a totally different set of meanings. Because what it really means now is, do you support when it's asked by the right, do you support the policies and values of the current state of Israel and what we're doing? And when it's used by the left, it kind of means the same thing, but it also means, do you support the existence of a state that discriminates against non-Jews or that privileges Jews? So to the extent that the argument is on those terms, I kind of, I don't know, I don't want to attribute, Amir, to you what it sounds like your question was asking, but I sort of believe that it's a silly debate, and that there's time better spent not thinking about whether one is Zionist or non-Zionist, or anti-Zionist or post-Zionist. There's a lawsuit that I just saw the complaint of here in the U.S. A woman, a young Jewish lefty woman, was a Hebrew teacher at a reform, that is progressive, shul in Westchester County, just outside of New York City, in which the rabbis were, this is a family conversation, so I'll say they were very NIF-y sounding rabbis, right? They were critical of Israel, loving, supportive, but very critical. The woman, it turns out, right before she took employment with the synagogue, had posted on Facebook or some social media a declaration that she was an anti-Zionist, that she had connections to Israel and Israelis, but she was against Zionism. Now, she was fired from the school, and she's suing them. It'll be an interesting lawsuit. She's not going to win, is my guess. But in any event, what was so interesting is, of course, she didn't mean, I'm going to guess, when she wrote that on Facebook, a 24-year-old liberal American Jew, she didn't mean, I am against the existence of the state of Israel. And the shul probably knew that when they fired her. that what she was trying to say was something more nuanced, that those of us who are more schooled in this discourse on this call, we wouldn't say it maybe in the same way in that forum. But in a way, the debate has lost all actual meaning. And so I tend to think it doesn't have a lot of utility, but it's there. And we have to recognize that that is still a litmus test that's being used. But ultimately, yeah, I think we're better served spending our time doing things other than declarations of whether we're Zionists or not and imposing the litmus test. By the way, New Israel Fund, as you all know, or many of you know, proudly, boasts we have Palestinian board members to the New Israel Fund, Palestinian citizens of Israel. Our staff in our offices in Israel is Jewish and Arab and Palestinian, and our grantee organizations are Jewish and Palestinian and mixed. And so, whereas I could say NIF supports that vision that is contained in Israel's Proclamation of Independence, like, are we a Zionist organization? There's no way that the non-Jewish Israeli board members of the New Israel Fund would describe themselves as seeing, as beneficial a state that privileges another citizen more than them. By the way, we have Jewish Israeli board members who feel that even more strongly. So to a certain extent, the discourse over Zionism to me loses all actual meaning and becomes a set of symbols and flags that people are posting in the ground. And in classic NIF fashion, I would rather actually articulate who we are and what we believe rather than whether we fit someone else's idea of a definition that we don't even happen to share. But that's probably a losing effort.
I have one statement and another question, and I think then we should come to a close. Mark Beers writes, the World Zionist Congress doesn't, this is one of the English words I can't pronounce.
Unanimously, right?
Unanimously, that's it. I will never learn to pronounce this word.
Too many vowels. Too many vowels.
Yeah, that's the point. That's my difficulty with French as well. Does not unanimously share the point of new Zionism. On the contrary. So I guess that's more kind of a comment from Mark, that there's more pluralism in the World Zionist Congress than on the hilltops. And there's a question by Rochelle Alibis. I think that what you just said about the nation state law comes very close to apartheid. So your position that only the politics in the occupied territories shows elements of apartheid is questionable. Tough question.
Yeah, I think that's a very reasonable point, and nothing, I said earlier, there's no such thing as a status quo when it comes to the political reality in Israel and the territories, and that's true with the sort of legal and social reality too. And things are changing, and they change all the time. I still feel comfortable with making a distinction because I think that the severity of what goes on the other side of the green line is totally different than what goes on the Israel side. And I think that it's not just sort of Hasbara talking points to point out that, as I do in the book, that until the last election, the third largest political party in the country was an majority Arab party, that there are Palestinian citizens of Israel who serve on the High Court of Justice. In other words, I still believe it's more complicated within Israel proper. But the truth is, there is a bit of a fiction to what I'm saying, right? Because, our friends at B'Tselem, our friends at Yesh Din would say exactly what I'm saying, and our friends at Human Rights Watch, that's their tack. But at B'Tselem and Amnesty International UK, right, their position is, look, it's one regime. It's the government of Israel that's controlling the reality on both sides of the green line. And so just because they're operating something that really clearly in the eyes of most legal scholars would fit the definition of the international crime of apartheid, not an analogy to South Africa, but the international crime of apartheid on one side of the green line, and it doesn't fit on the other side, doesn't mean that there is not such discrimination on the other side that you could declare the whole thing an apartheid regime, right? Like I think that's a reasonable argument. I don't happen to subscribe to it now, but talk to me in 2 years. Like let's see where things are. But I think I think Rochelle's point is well taken. I also see very quickly in the chat that someone asked what the other point of correction was. So I can tell you very quickly, because unlike the point that that was made today, which was a really excellent one, this was a really silly one, but I think you'll all get a kick out of it. It turns out my book was selected by the Jewish Theological Seminary, which is the main conservative rabbinical seminary in the United States in New York City, the place where Heschel taught, they're going to give the book to every rabbinical student, which is terrific, right? They're going to get this NIFE book. But when they read it carefully, the chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary looked at one of the maps, and Christopher, my illustrator, in this map, it was the map of the territory. It was a before and after the 6-Day War map. You can find it in the book if you have it. And in the key to the map, Christopher wrote Israel, and the shaded. He indicated that the shaded area was Israel, and the non-shaded area was occupied by Israel, or something like that. And if one was really looking for it, you could think that in the before 1967 map of Little Israel, pre-1967, the key made it seem like that Israel proper was occupied by Israel. Now, you'd have to really go through a lot of mental acrobatics to get to, like, how would Israel be occupying Israel? But still, they were worried enough that they called me up and they said, look, we just bought 500 copies of this book for every young conservative rabbinical student in America. There, you see it. And they said, please tell us, was this intentional? I said, what would I be intending to say by that? But I said, and thus undermining the other 379 pages of the book. So anyway, they were relieved, and I said, look, I'll make sure that in the paperback edition, by the way, no one has brought that up or even noticed it in any of the book reviews. Thankfully, no one has noticed the very wise comment that one of you made today either. But so I'll change the silly thing on the map, and I'm going to change the nation state piece as well. So this has been on those terms alone. This has been the most useful book conversation I've had since October. So thank you.
Next time you do a colored edition, so this can't happen because the illustrator had only gray to distinguish.
That's right.
Territories.
Right.
I just have to end up with the humor we started. To end up with a few last comments in the chat. Mark Baer told us that he's not talking about the World Zionist Congress from the outside, insisting that he's in fact one of the 2 Swiss delegates to the World Zionist Congress. And he also insisted to mention, and that is right, that there are parties in Israel like Meretz, Atznei, Yes Atid, who opposed the nation-state law, and they did for quite a while. I mean,
that's right, and that's why, as I said earlier, that's why I said I understand the B'Tselem. I don't know if Rochelle. I don't want to attribute it to Rochelle herself, but I understand the B'Tselem amnesty argument. I don't agree with it at this point in time because there were many political parties in Israel that opposed it, and it was also opposed by the president of the state of Israel at the time, a man of the Likud, Ruby Rivlin, who said, he said this is a bad law. It upends the balance between democratic and Jewish. It privileges one group of Israelis over others. And he said, if it comes to my desk, I will sign it as I'm required to do in my ceremonial role as president, but I'll sign the bill in Arabic. And that's exactly what he did. So for that reason, I feel that there's still enough alive in Israel that I'm not willing to sort of designate it put it in the other category right now.
Yeah. And I have a last note by Pierre Loeb, which I would love to conclude with, and that is that not only the illustrations and the personal comments, what does he say? He did not only read the footnotes usually, but he likes the pictures, but particularly in this case, he loved the footnotes, which are coming very often with a little asterisk. And then so you have some personal remarks on the bottom line of the pages. And particularly these personal comments on the bottom line of the pages, Pierre read with great fun and made the book a really great experience. And if somebody can say something like this about footnotes, the more it's true about the rest of the book. So if you don't get it from the theological seminary, just go to your next bookshop, or probably in the NIF, you already have a good distribution line for the book. Yeah, have fun with reading it, use it in conversations. And I just hope very much to have the next conversation with you, Daniel, somewhere in real life. Thanks to everybody coming to this Zoom discussion. I hope, NIF, that we had a good conversation. And I say farewell, and maybe Yaron or Rachel, you want to conclude with some remarks from...
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Hanno and Daniel. Daniel, congratulations, and thank you very much for this book. And thank you, Hanno, for the wonderful moderation. And thank you to our audience for being with us this evening. There is so much to talk about, but first you should really all order the book and read it.
Thank you all so much.
Thanks,
and
Daniel.
keep in touch with us through our German, Austrian, and Swiss Facebook and newsletters. And good evening to everyone, and to next time. Bye-bye.
Can't wait to see you all in person.
Yes.
We too.
Shalom.
Bye-bye.
Hope to see you. Shalom, shalom. All the best.
All the best. Bye-bye.